This is my video review for the Eversolo F10 Stereo Power Amplifier that you can see on the rack there behind me. And I want to start this review with a question. How many of you have spent more money on your amplifiers than your speakers? Because we are always told to spend as much as we can on speakers, but I know a great pair of speakers will underperform if the amplifier driving them is not up to the task. And in reverse, a great amplifier will always get the maximum out of the speakers, and I think this is something to consider. But that creates the second question: what is a great amplifier? And if you had the choice between two great amplifiers, one that sounds very transparent and the other that has a very distinct sound character, which one would you choose? But before you answer that, surely you need to know what that distinct character is. And in regards to the Eversolo F10, it is an amplifier that has a very distinct character. And I can make this a really quick review for you. It sounds very full and big in the bass. It sounds very rich and warm and smooth and sweet in the vocals. And it's a bit dark and play it safe sounding in the highs. So it's a very pleasing stereo power amplifier. But you want to know more, of course, don't you? And if you want to know how it compares to two other amplifiers around the same price, stick around. The F10 is, I believe, Eversolo's first from the ground up designed power amplifier, and it's a Class AB design. And it's definitely intended to be the perfect partner to their DMP A10 digital music streamer, server, DAC and preamplifier all in one that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago and thought was excellent. So the F10 has some big shoes to fill. It has to live up to the quality of the A10, because if it doesn't, using that as a whole system doesn't work. And it certainly looks almost as good as the A10, as it looks very similar, although it's noticeably larger in height. And I do like the exposed heatsink fins more on the F10 than I do on the A10, as I think it suits an amplifier's design better. But I will admit, when you put the two together, the overall design language makes sense. The build quality of the F10 is nice. I do like the curved angles of the chassis and how it's built to look screwless, which is nicer and more modern for sure. And it's also a reasonably heavy power amplifier at 18 kilograms, and you can see why when I remove the lid, as the best bit about the F10 is definitely inside. One of the biggest visual draws is, of course, the VU meters that illuminate very bright. And it's great to have VU meters on a power amplifier, right? Well, only if the VU meters are good, and these VU meters are not my favourite part of the F10, although I think they should be. And I asked Eversolo to tell me about the VU meters, and this is what they said, and I have notes here so that I get this bang on. The F10's VU meter converts the actual output sound amplitude into power. It is entirely analog, driving a coil in response to changes in the signal. When current flows through the coil, it generates a magnetic force. The stronger the current, the stronger the magnetic effect, resulting in greater swing and responsiveness. So that all sounds great, excuse the pun. But in practice, the F10's VU meters have a very skittish movement about them, and it's not made sense to me when I compare to other VU meters that I have seen, to the point I thought I must be going crazy. However, when you use the F10 in bridged mono mode, this changes, as you can hopefully see. Now the VU meters movement makes sense to me, or at least they seem to work more like how I expect them to, again, when used in bridged mono mode. And maybe there is something in that about the F10's overall amplifier design. But I do wish there was a switch or control to be able to disable the illumination of the VU meters. I would just personally prefer that from an aesthetic point of view, because I just don't love the illumination of the VU meters, and maybe I'm being a little bit overly critical and fussy there, but of course that is my job. But round the back, I do really appreciate the layout of the F10. The speaker cable terminals are separated enough from the power and from the signal to not trigger my OCD, so that is all great. What I appreciated most is the labelling, so I could wire up for bridged mono use without needing to look in the manual. Other manufacturers, please take note of this. And there are switches for adjusting the F10's sensitivity, how the amplifier powers on from either a sound signal or from the trigger, and there is a trigger cable included in the box, and that was a very nice surprise. And you can easily select to use the F10 as a stereo power amp or in bridged mono mode with the flick of a switch. So again, I appreciate that simplicity. And as requested, you can see on the rack there behind me, I have two F10 here. So I have been comparing one in stereo versus two in bridged mono mode. And that's very interesting. And I've been comparing the two to a larger, more expensive stereo power amplifier in the esoteric SO3. And I've only just begun this testing, but let me tell you, there's a lot in that actually, a very interesting that it's worth and deserves its own dedicated video. So I will be making that in the future, so look out for it. But you of course want to see inside, as did I, because the marketing of the F10 showed some very cool things that I was extra keen to see in the flesh. And let me tell you now, the 1000-watt dual channel linear power supply the F10 boasts is really impressive because I have a soft spot for a big transformer. And the F10 boasts a very sizable one. And I appreciate you can't tell the scale of it from the video. So look at my hand and how it's fully stretched out. And now look at my hand, obviously fully stretched out. It's kind of about the same size as my head, almost, isn't it? And I have a pretty big Swede. So like the transformer in this, yeah, it's pretty sizable. It's a much larger toroidal transformer than I was expecting to see in a power amplifier around this price. But that's not the only standout thing. Look at all the yellow capacitors. Some of them are pretty sizable. And I had never seen yellow caps before, but upon a close inspection, they are Eversolo caps, or at least that is how they are labelled. But I couldn't find any information for the total capacitor bank the F10 is offering, which is a shame. And something else I've not seen on an amplifier before is the big chip looking thing Eversolo are calling this high fidelity audio processing, which seems to be a clever symmetrical feedback technology, and to me this has to be partly responsible for the F10's distinctive sound and also how they are achieving very impressive claimed specs such as 0.008% THD and 113 dB of dynamic range. And the same chip seems to be used for the amplifier's input board too. So the sound is seemingly being managed from inputs all the way through to the 10 MOSFETs or 5 pairs per channel. And from what I know, MOSFETs generally have a warmer sound character for transistors, but I was not able to get them on camera as they are hidden behind the circuit board. Even with my non-engineer eyes, I can tell there is a lot that is impressive there about the F10 for its asking price of £2,199. And as I said, it's a Class AB design that can deliver 200 watts of power into 8 ohms, 320 watts of power per channel into 4 ohms, and 450 watts of power per channel into 2 ohms. So it's very impressive to see a 2 ohm rating for the power amplifier. And yes, we are not getting the doubling of power as the impedance halves, but those numbers are still impressive, I feel, and they get considerably more impressive if you use the F10 in bridged mono mode. But they are just numbers on paper that don't really mean anything in isolation. And all the caps and big toroidal, it's all eye candy. What matters more is how the F10 sounds and how it sounds compared to other power amplifiers around the same price. And I have done a huge amount of comparison listening between the F10 and 2 other excellent power amplifiers around this price. So, was the F10 the best? One of the amplifiers I have been comparing the F10 to is 2024's claimed giant killer, the Galion A75, which is another Class AB designed amplifier that can only deliver, on paper, 75 watts per channel. But because it's a high current design, those numbers don't tell you anything. And it costs $1,495, sold direct, plus shipping and taxes. So about the same price by the time one gets into the UK. And if we look inside the Galion, it's also an impressive looking built amplifier with a lot of big capacitors, and it uses two smaller toroidals instead of one big one. And I really don't know what's better, one big one or two smaller ones, and I'm sure there is a mum joke in there somewhere, but I daren't go there. And the second amp I have been comparing the F10 to is a great Class D example, the NAD M23, that has the same power on paper, 200 watts per channel into 8 ohms, but can deliver peaks of a lot more. And it looks like this on the inside, which is a totally different design and interesting in itself, but it costs quite a lot more, £3,399. I did my first round of listening, testing and comparison using the Audio Solutions Figaro M2 speakers that are excellent and very clear sounding speakers, so perfect for hearing any differences. But with a higher sensitivity of 91.5 dB and a 4 ohm impedance, they are not overly challenging speakers to drive for the amplifiers. So really I was listening for any main tonal or general characteristic differences between them to allow me to clearly define for you what the F10 sounds like. And it was really easy because the F10 has such a distinct sound character. And I can say the F10 is excellent paired with Eversolo's A10 for speakers like this. The Figaro have a solid bass, but one that I think is modest in its output, paired with quite a lively and dynamic mid-range and high frequencies. And it's a speaker looking to give you a nice tonally full vocal and a spacious audiophile 3D soundstage with quite a lot of high frequency vibrancy. And all three amplifiers worked very well with the Figaro speakers, but the F10 was my preferred of the three because it's darker highs, very warm and rich, and really quite sweet sounding mids and vocals, and its full bass balanced great with these speakers. And because the Figaro are already great for opening up the soundstage clear and wide with very good depth, the F10 has a more forward sound compared to the NAD and Galion amps that both want to also open up the soundstage in the middle of the speakers and emphasize clarity. And that was more than fine and very enjoyable in their own rights with these speakers. But over longer listening sessions, I just found myself not quite as happy or not quite as satisfied as when I was listening with the A10 F10 pairing, because I was just missing the big strength of the F10. That is that big, full, warm sound. And yes, the other two amplifiers, the Galion and the NAD, sounded a bit more specific, a bit more precise. They did open the soundstage up a little more, but I found myself missing that kind of fullness and the warmth and the richness. It just balanced really nicely with the Figaro speakers. So in this situation, in this testing, I would say the F10 was the winner. It was the one I preferred the most out of the three. And that was, of course, very useful testing and comparison, but I didn't think it was enough. So I did the same listening comparison with all three amplifiers, but now using a larger, more demanding, lower sensitivity Canton Reference 2 speakers that have the polar opposite sound design compared to the Figaro. The Cantons sound more bass first, and bass big and bold and warm straight away, with a more relaxed mid-range and treble. And they are less about emphasizing soundstage spaciousness and more about the music as a whole. And they are super smooth and graceful speakers, and naturally they respond differently to the amplifier that drives them, and I think they want a different sound coming in to get the best out of them. So in this listening comparison, the result was the opposite. Here the F10 sounded very nice still, but I found it was a bit congested and a bit flat sounding. There was not enough see through the speakers onto a soundstage happening for me, and it sounded a little bit underpowered for the bass. Even though that's definitely not the case, the bass was just a bit too thick and not as controlled as I would like it to be. But the vocals still sounded lovely. They sounded full and rich. but they were not cutting through with enough clarity for me. And that was because I think the dark treble was just suffocating the height of the soundstage and the energy and the speed of the music some. Don't get me wrong, it was still a great sound. It was still very enjoyable and very pleasing, but overall I didn't find it as good as a pairing. And in stark contrast now, the NAD and Galion did a much better job of seemingly controlling these more demanding speakers. Or maybe they just opened up the soundstage window much wider and clearer. The NAD definitely controlled the bass better than the F10. The NAD is a really great amplifier for bass control, and that was very obvious here. But I was not as keen on the mids and highs from the NAD. They were the cleanest sounding of the three, but they were also the most dry, and I missed the sweetness of the F10 in the mid-range region, even though the vocals were not as clear sounding. And the Galion split the difference here much better. It sounded sweeter in the mids and highs compared to the NAD, and more lively in the treble compared to both, which balanced better with the Canton speakers. And most notable to me was that the Galion took me the deepest into the music through its clarity and the opening up of the soundstage window. It got me closer to a huge money mega system that I was listening to at the same time for the overall depth of music quality. So you could call that a really big win for the Galion power amplifier, considering it has the lowest retail price of all three. And that is why the Galion has been called by many, the giant killer amplifier of 2024. But when you look at the bigger picture, that can be quite a misleading statement. However, it's an excellent power amplifier for the money, an excellent power amplifier when used with the right speakers. But that made me think, do I need to test with another set of speakers just to be 100% sure? But I didn't, because by now I'd heard enough differences, and I could specifically tell you how the F10 sounds. It sounds clean, it sounds smooth, the music is very organised, the vocals are full and rich, warm and sweet, and that is all really great. The treble is very nice in terms of detail, but it's definitely darker, and that means the F10 is not the best power amplifier when it comes to soundstage spaciousness, or for sounding the most open or clear, see through the speakers onto the music. Instead, the F10 wants to kind of pull the sound in on itself a little bit, which is where that full-bodied and fullness of sound comes from. It pulls it in, enrichens it and thickens it up a little bit rather than open it all up, which can often make music sound leaner, more spacious but leaner. The F10 pulls it in. So what that means is you need to like that sound character, and it sounds bad by explaining it like that, but you don't hear it as bad. Actually, you hear it as a real positive thing with some speakers. And I've listened to loads of people's speakers and systems where they already sound a little bit lean, or they maybe sound a little bit bright. And that can often be the case with a lot of streamed digital music. So an amplifier that can enrich the sound, make it a bit warmer and more bold and more pleasing, even if that pulls it in a little bit, actually can be a really positive thing. And, can be like that thing you're looking for, right? To just enrich and make everything smoother and sweeter and more warm and more pleasing. So I think this amplifier sound character will be a great choice for many speakers, but maybe not all of them. And I think a great example could be with Wharfedale's Super and Linton. I think the A10 F10 would be great with the Supers, but maybe less good with the normal Linton. But that's just a guesstimation, as I have not tested these for sure. So I have mentioned a lot of positives there for the F10's sound characteristics, and they are positives, like a big, full, warm, pleasing sound. How can that not be a positive? But the negative, the trade-off for that for me, is that the sound is always managed that way. And it's the same at lower volumes as it is at higher volumes, which could be great for people to know. But when I turn systems up loud, I want them to just loosen off a little bit and just have that extra level of excitement and attack to come through. And you don't really get that from the F10. It always stays that little bit reserved and a little bit play it safe. It never just has that extra bit of kind of pizzazz and bite to its sound. That can be a great thing a lot of the time, but sometimes, a little bit more excitement in the music can be a good thing. But that is not the full picture for the F10 either, as its sound character does change somewhat when you run two of them in bridged mono mode. And the F10 actually makes more sense to me when you use it like that as a power amplifier. But like I said before, that needs a whole video's worth of explanation of the differences. So look out for that video coming soon. Another potential negative, I think it's just a point of distinction, is that the F10 does run pretty warm. It runs much warmer than the NAD, although you expect that for a Class D amplifier, but it runs a lot warmer than the Galion, like noticeably warmer. So I wouldn't put it into some kind of furniture that doesn't have some ventilation. So in summary then, the Eversolo F10, I think it's a really nice power amplifier. It has a very pleasing aesthetic, but also a very pleasing sound character that does a lot of things right. It's a really great amplifier to listen to with the right speakers. But most importantly, I think it is the perfect partner to Eversolo's A10. I think Eversolo have got that pairing and that bit just right. The two really do complement each other. And like I said, with the right speakers, you can get a great sound from this system. And I think there'll be lots of speakers and people in rooms that will really benefit from this type of setup. Great features and a sound that is full and warm and pleasing. It's dynamic as well, but maybe it's not perfect in every way, and some other amplifiers can give you some other things or some other standout positives. But will you enjoy them more for the long haul, like for lots of listening across lots of different music, across lots of different days, maybe or maybe not? I think the benefit, or what they've done here, Eversolo, with the A10 F10 is make a system that's very pleasing and not that fussy for the music that you feed it to. And that's going to be great for a lot of people. So, I definitely applaud them for that. It's a really nice setup that you can take even further when you run two F10s in bridged mono mode. That gets a little bit more exciting for somebody like me. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you have enjoyed it, hit the thumbs up button and of course, subscribe to the channel to see more.